Welcome, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. Today, we're sharing a story that will ignite your spirit and challenge your perspective. Kayla Brooks, a self-made billionaire, faces a shocking act of discrimination during a flight, an injustice that she refuses to let stand. Her courage to fight back doesn't just change her life, it sparks a movement for equality, inspiring us all to stand tall and never back down. If this story resonates with you, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another powerful tale of resilience, justice, and empowerment. Let's get started. The Denver International Airport buzzed with the usual mix of hurried footsteps, distant announcements, and the clinking of coffee cups at nearby kiosks. Among the sea of travelers, Kayla Brooks stood out, a striking figure of grace and confidence. Her tailored navy blue pantsuit hugged her tall, lean frame, and her natural curls framed her face, a picture of composed brilliance. Kayla, at just 34 years old, had built a tech empire from scratch, becoming one of the most influential Black entrepreneurs in the country. She had spent the past 3 days at an exhausting tech summit, fending off competitors and cementing partnerships that would reshape industries. Now, she was eager to return home to Atlanta for a much-needed rest. Clutching her sleek leather tote, Kayla made her way toward the first-class gate, her heels clicking against the polished tile floor. Her boarding pass, printed in bold letters with first class, was neatly tucked into her hand. As she approached, a member of the airline's staff, a young woman with a strained smile, stepped forward, her posture hesitating, as though bracing for something unpleasant. "Excuse me, ma'am," the woman began, her voice polite yet firm. "There's been a mix-up with your reservation. Unfortunately, your seat is no longer available. We'll need to reassign you to another seat." Kayla paused, her brows knitting in confusion. She glanced down at her boarding pass and then back at the woman. "I'm sorry, there must be a mistake. I reserved 2A weeks ago and checked in hours ago. This is my seat." The staff member shifted uncomfortably, her apologetic smile slipping. "I understand, ma'am, but the seat has been reassigned. We'll find you an alternative in economy class. Please follow me." The words hit Kayla like a slap. Economy class? She hadn't flown anything but first class in years, not out of arrogance, but because she'd worked tirelessly to afford it. It was a symbol of her success, a reward for years of sleepless nights and relentless hustle. Yet here she was, being told to accept less than she'd paid for without any valid explanation. "Excuse me," Kayla said, her voice steady but firm. "There's clearly a mistake here. My boarding pass shows first class, and I checked in on time. I'd like to speak with your supervisor." The staff member hesitated, her eyes darting toward the gate, where passengers were beginning to board. After a tense moment, she nodded curtly and walked off. Kayla stood her ground, feeling the weight of a few stares from other travelers who'd overheard the conversation. A few minutes later, a tall man in a crisp pilot's uniform strode toward her, his expression unreadable, but his posture commanding. His name tag read, Richard Edwards, and the epaulettes on his shoulders gleamed under the harsh airport lights. He stopped in front of Kayla, his icy blue eyes scanning her with thinly veiled irritation. "I'm Captain Edwards," he announced, his tone clipped. "I understand there's a problem?" "Yes," Kayla replied, lifting her chin slightly. "There seems to be an error with my reservation. I booked 2A in first class, and I have no intention of being moved." Captain Edwards folded his arms, his gaze hardening. "I'm afraid the seat has already been reassigned. We don't have room in first class, and I'll need you to cooperate so we can proceed with boarding." "Reassigned to whom?" Kayla asked, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I paid for my ticket. I checked in hours ago. If my seat isn't available, I'd like a valid explanation." The captain's lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes flicked to Kayla's boarding pass before he said, "I don't have to explain the specifics to you. The decision has been made, and we need you to vacate the seat." Kayla's heart began to race, but she refused to let it show. She could feel the weight of every stare in the vicinity, some curious, some indifferent, and others laced with judgment. She had faced plenty of microaggressions in her rise to the top, but something about this interaction felt different. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about the way the captain looked at her, as though she didn't belong there in the first place. "I'm not moving," she said firmly. Her voice was calm, controlled, but unwavering. I've paid for my seat, and I'm not stepping aside unless you provide a valid reason. The captain's expression darkened. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, but not the condescension in his tone. Look, Miss Brooks, I don't have time for this. I'm running a flight, not a debate. Either you cooperate, or we'll have security handle it. Kayla's stomach churned, but she didn't falter. Then call security, she said, meeting his glare with her own, because I won't let you treat me as if I don't belong. The captain's jaw tightened, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Around them, the tension was palpable, the air heavy with anticipation. Passengers whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Kayla and the imposing pilot. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene as it unfolded. Kayla could feel her pulse hammering in her ears, but she stood tall, her presence unyielding. She wasn't just defending her seat. She was defending her dignity, her right to exist in spaces she'd worked so hard to occupy. Captain Edwards straightened, his face a mask of barely concealed frustration. Fine, he said coldly. Security it is. Without another word, he turned on his heel, leaving Kayla standing alone under the harsh scrutiny of the crowd. The tension from the gate spilled onto the plane as Kayla boarded, her boarding pass still clutched in her hand like a lifeline. The sleek interiors of the first-class cabin, with its plush leather seats and muted gold accents, felt colder now, its luxury overshadowed by the earlier clash. Passengers were settling in, their conversations a low hum punctuated by the occasional laughter or the rustling of newspapers. Kayla ignored the stares and murmurs that followed her as she found her seat, 2A, her rightful place. She slid her tote bag under the seat in front of her and settled in, her heart still racing. Taking a deep breath, she reminded herself of the countless battles she'd fought to claim her space in a world that often tried to deny it to her. This was just another one, she thought. Another hurdle she would overcome with grace and resilience. But before she could fully relax, the unmistakable figure of Captain Richard Edwards appeared in the aisle, his towering frame blocking the light like a storm cloud. His jaw was set, his narrowed eyes locking onto her like a target. Behind him trailed the same frazzled staff member, who looked as though she wished the ground would swallow her whole. Miss Brooks, the captain began, his tone sharp and commanding, we need to have another discussion about your seat. Kayla glanced up from her phone, where she'd been scrolling through emails, and met his gaze. She could feel the tension emanating from him, his posture radiating authority. She'd dealt with men like him before, men who believed their power was absolute, their decisions unquestionable. It was a language she had learned to speak fluently over the years, but today she wasn't in the mood for diplomacy. I believe the discussion is over, Captain Edwards, she replied, her tone calm but unyielding. This is my seat, as confirmed by my boarding pass. I'm not moving. The captain's lips thinned into a hard line. The seat has been reassigned. I'm asking you to move, now. And I'm asking for a valid explanation, Kayla countered, because I've yet to hear one. His eyes flicked to the surrounding passengers, who were now watching intently, their conversations fading into silence. The weight of their stares seemed to irritate him further. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice but not his hostility. This is my plane. I'm responsible for its operation, and I don't have time for this back and forth. You'll move, or you'll be removed. Kayla's heart hammered in her chest, but outwardly she remained composed. Captain Edwards, I paid for this seat, and I have every right to sit here. If you're going to remove me, you'd better have a damn good reason, because I'm not going anywhere without one. The captain straightened, his face flushed with anger. His voice, now loud enough to carry through the cabin, sliced through the air. Ma'am, I'm giving you one last chance to comply. If you refuse, I'll have security escort you off this plane. Gasps rippled through the cabin, and Kayla could feel dozens of eyes boring into her. Some passengers whispered to one another, their words just out of earshot, while others pulled out their phones, discreetly recording the unfolding drama. Unfazed, Kayla stood her ground, her voice steady but resolute. Call security if you must, but I'm not moving from the seat I rightfully reserved. The captain's patience snapped. In a move that stunned everyone watching, he reached down and grabbed her arm, yanking her up from the seat. The force of the action caused her to stumble, her heel catching on the edge of the aisle carpet. Kayla's tote bag toppled over, spilling its contents, her tablet, a leather-bound notebook, and a fountain pen, onto the floor. A collective gasp echoed through the cabin. Kayla caught herself against the armrest, her breath hitching as she straightened, her eyes blazing with a mix of shock and fury. For a moment, the entire plane seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it was suffocating. "What the hell are you doing?" she demanded, her voice louder now, filled with indignation. She bent to pick up her belongings, her hands trembling slightly as she shoved them back into her bag. "Escorting you from the seat," the captain barked, his face red with anger. "You're disrupting the flight and refusing to comply with crew instructions." Kayla stood tall, her chin lifted in defiance. "No," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. "You're assaulting a paying customer because you think you can get away with it. But let me assure you, Captain Edwards, you've just made a mistake you won't forget." The passengers were no longer silent. Murmurs of outrage and disbelief filled the cabin, some directed at the captain, others in support of Kayla. A man in a business suit leaned into the aisle, his phone aimed squarely at the scene. "You can't just put your hands on her like that," he exclaimed. Others nodded in agreement, their expressions a mix of anger and discomfort. The captain seemed momentarily rattled by the backlash, but his resolve didn't waver. "Enough," he snapped, addressing the entire cabin. "This is an operational decision, and it's final. If anyone has an issue, you can take it up with the airline after the flight." Kayla, her fury simmering just beneath the surface, took a step closer to him. "Oh, I'll take it up with the airline," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "And with my lawyers, and with every news outlet in the country. But for now, I'm sitting in my seat." Without waiting for his response, she turned and lowered herself back into 2A, her movements deliberate and unyielding. She crossed her legs and folded her hands in her lap, her posture a picture of calm defiance. Around her, the murmurs grew louder, the passengers clearly siding with her. Captain Edwards stood frozen for a moment, his jaw tight, his fists clenched at his sides. Then, with a sharp glare, he spun on his heel and marched toward the front of the plane, barking instructions to the staff member who scurried after him. Kayla watched him go, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. As the whispers swirled around her and phones continued to record, Kayla knew this wasn't over. But she also knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. Kayla barely registered the cold, hard floor beneath her as she hit the ground, her palms scraping against the carpeted aisle. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The murmurs of the passengers, the hum of the plane's air system, even her own thoughts. Time slowed as she processed what had just happened. She, Kayla Brooks, a woman who had built an empire from the ground up, had been physically forced from her seat as if she were nothing more than an unruly child. A gasp rippled through the cabin, followed by the quiet buzz of whispers as passengers exchanged shocked glances. Some craned their necks to get a better view, while others turned away, their discomfort visible in their body language. Phones flashed in the background, no longer discreet, but openly recording as passengers captured the fallout. Kayla looked up, her eyes locking onto Captain Edwards. He stood over her, his face set in an expression of steely resolve, but there was no mistaking the fire of anger in his eyes. He didn't offer a hand to help her up, nor a word of apology. Instead, he turned sharply and barked toward the cabin crew at the front of the plane. "Get security in here now!" His voice boomed, silencing the growing protests from a few passengers. Kayla pushed herself up slowly, her movements deliberate and measured, though her heart was pounding furiously. Her knees ached, and a stinging sensation radiated from her hands where the rough carpet had left faint scratches. She felt the burn of humiliation more acutely than any physical pain. She straightened her blazer, brushing herself off with a precision that belied the storm raging inside her. "You just assaulted me," she said, her voice steady but dangerously low, her gaze piercing through the captain's smug exterior. "You'll regret this." He didn't flinch. If anything, her defiance seemed to harden his stance. "You were asked to comply. You refused," he said, his words clipped as if explaining a routine procedure. "This isn't about you. It's about maintaining order on this flight." Kayla opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the sound of heavy footsteps filled the air. Two security officers in crisp uniforms entered the cabin, their expressions unreadable as they quickly assessed the situation. The tension in the air was palpable, a thick fog of outrage, disbelief, and silent complicity. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his tone firm, but not unkind, "we've been called to escort you off the plane." Kayla turned to face them, her posture regal despite the bruising of her dignity. She noticed one of the officers glance at her boarding pass, which she still clutched tightly in her hand, the paper now crumpled from her grip. "Do you see this?" she said, holding it up. Her voice rose slightly, carrying over the whispers of the passengers. "This is a valid first-class boarding pass. I paid for this seat. I have every right to be here." The officer hesitated, his brow furrowing as if he were trying to piece together the situation. But before he could respond, Captain Edwards interjected. "She was disruptive and refused to follow crew instructions," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "This is a safety issue. She needs to be removed immediately." The officer sighed, clearly torn. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but we need to follow protocol. Please gather your belongings and come with us." Kayla hesitated for a moment, her gaze sweeping the cabin. She saw passengers watching her, their expressions a mix of pity, sympathy, and unease. A young woman across the aisle mouthed something to her. It looked like, "I'm sorry," but she didn't dare speak aloud. Others avoided her gaze entirely, pretending to be absorbed in their phones or the in-flight magazine. Realizing she was outnumbered, Kayla nodded stiffly and bent down to retrieve her tote bag. The humiliation was suffocating, wrapping around her like a vice. She felt the weight of every eye on her as she straightened, clutching her bag tightly against her side. As the officers led her down the aisle, the murmurs grew louder. A man in a business suit called out, "This is ridiculous! She didn't do anything wrong." Another passenger, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, added, "She showed her ticket. She has every right to be here." But their voices were drowned out by the larger silence of compliance. No one else spoke up. No one else stood up. Kayla walked through the aisle with her head held high, refusing to let her shoulders sag under the weight of the moment. If they were going to humiliate her, she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. The cold air of the terminal hit her like a slap as the officers escorted her off the jet bridge. The bustling activity of the airport felt surreal after the suffocating tension of the plane. Kayla's heels clicked sharply against the polished floors, a sound that echoed in her mind as a reminder of her resolve. But the ache in her chest was harder to ignore. It wasn't just about the physical shove or even the public humiliation. It was the bitter realization that her achievements, her wealth, her hard-earned status had done nothing to shield her from blatant prejudice. She was Kayla Brooks, a self-made billionaire, a woman who had shattered glass ceilings in an industry that had tried to keep her out. And yet, here she was, treated as though her success, her very humanity, meant nothing. As she walked through the terminal, she heard the ping of her phone. She glanced down and saw a notification from one of her team members. "Call me. We need to strategize." Her lips pressed into a thin line. The storm brewing inside her now had a direction. This wasn't just an act of injustice. It was an opportunity to expose a larger problem, one she knew all too well. Kayla straightened her posture, her steps purposeful as she headed toward the exit. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. If Captain Edwards and that airline thought they could humiliate her and get away with it, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The sound of Kayla's heels clicking against the polished floor faded as she finally found her way to a quiet corner of the airport lounge. The chaos of the terminal behind her felt like a world away. Her fingers, still trembling from the rush of emotions, hovered over the screen of her phone for a moment before she dialed her father's number. Charles Brooks, her father, was a towering figure in the world of aviation. A legend in the industry, he had built a global empire from the ground up. As the partial owner of the airline that had humiliated her, his influence was vast, and Kayla knew that if anyone could make this right, it was him. But even more than that, he was her protector, her rock. She needed him now more than ever. The call connected, and the familiar voice on the other end of the line was steady at first, as always. But as she began recounting the events of the flight, detailing the humiliation she'd faced, she could feel the shift in his tone. "He shoved you? Off the plane?" In front of everyone? Charles's voice cracked with disbelief, then sharpened with fury. His normally calm demeanor was gone, replaced by an icy rage that Kayla had rarely heard from him. "Yes, Dad," she replied, her voice still quivering despite her best effort to stay composed. "He treated me like I didn't belong there, like I was some kind of inconvenience. I've never felt so powerless." Kayla's words hung heavy in the air, and she could almost feel her father's thoughts racing across the distance, processing the details. For a moment, there was only silence, and then his voice returned, colder than before. "You did everything right, Kayla. Everything. And he did that to you? In front of everyone?" His voice hardened further, the anger palpable in each word. "That's not just a mistake. It's a deliberate insult, and I'll be damned if they think they can get away with it." Kayla let out a shaky breath, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. She didn't have to explain to her father why this mattered so much. He understood. He always had. But knowing that he was equally outraged, that he was prepared to take action, made her feel less alone. "Dad, I don't know how to process this. It wasn't just about the seat. It wasn't just about the physical shove. It was the way he looked at me, like I didn't matter." Her voice faltered for a moment, the weight of the humiliation pressing down on her chest. "Like I was invisible." Charles was quiet for a moment, his fury palpable even through the phone. When he spoke again, his words were sharp and measured. "I'm going to make sure the airline understands exactly what they did. Captain Edwards will be held accountable, and that airline will be forced to answer for this. You don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong, Kayla. Not him. Not anyone." His promise was like a balm to her wounded pride. Kayla could feel the anger bubbling up within her again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the crushing anger of humiliation, but the kind that could ignite a fire in her soul. The kind of fire that would propel her to make things right. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, feeling the tears she had been holding back start to sting at the corners of her eyes. "I need to know that this won't just be swept under the rug." "It won't be," Charles said firmly, his tone brokering no argument. "I'll get in touch with the board and escalate this immediately. The whole world is going to know what happened. You're not just some rich woman who can be pushed around. You're Kayla Brooks. Don't ever forget that." Kayla's heart swelled at the sound of his confidence. It was exactly what she needed to hear right now. His belief in her had always been unwavering, and now it was her turn to prove him right. She wasn't going to let this go. "I'm not going to let him get away with this," she replied, the fire in her voice igniting. "I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person Captain Edwards is and what kind of company that airline is running." Charles let out a soft sigh of approval. "That's my girl. Now, you take care of yourself, and I'll take care of the rest. I'll call you as soon as I've made some progress." The call ended, but Kayla was no longer just the woman who had been humiliated on that plane. No. She was a force now, a woman with the resources, the power, and the determination to see this injustice undone. She had already fought for everything she had achieved, and this was just another battle, one that she would win. She stood up from her seat in the lounge, her eyes scanning the room. She had work to do, but first, she needed to regain her composure. She needed to take a breath and let the anger settle into resolve. The humiliation was still fresh, still stinging, but it was no longer the defining moment of her day. No, she would make sure that what came next, the vengeance, the justice, would define this chapter. And Captain Edwards? He was about to learn that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Kayla was ready, and she was not backing down. The moment the call ended with her father, Kayla felt the weight of the world press down on her once more. But now, it wasn't just anger and humiliation that fueled her. It was something much deeper. The desire for change. She had never been one to sit back and let injustices slide by. She had built her empire from the ground up, defying odds and expectations. And now she was facing a challenge she wasn't going to back down from. She was alone in the airport lounge, but within minutes of stepping back into the terminal, her phone buzzed nonstop with notifications. At first, she glanced at them, but the sheer volume soon made her stomach churn. Messages, texts, emails, they all piled in, some of them from people she didn't know, others from friends and associates. But as she scrolled through the flood of messages, one thing became clear. The world was watching. The videos from passengers on her flight had already gone viral. They had captured every moment, her being forcibly shoved out of her seat, her stumble, and the shouts of security arriving moments later. Kayla's heart sank as she watched the footage replaying across her screen. The rawness of the moment made her wince, but it also ignited a fire in her chest. The hashtags began to appear almost immediately. Justice for Kayla Brooks. Racism in the skies. The words burned in her mind as she saw them trending worldwide. News outlets were quick to pick up the story. Major networks broadcast the videos, showing footage of Kayla's ejection from the plane with expert commentary. It wasn't just a story of an airline mistake. It was the story of blatant racial discrimination in the most public and personal of spaces. Her father's earlier promise rang in her ears. The whole world is going to know what happened. It wasn't just his words that filled her with determination. It was the voice of the people rising up in unison with her. What had been a personal injustice was now a global conversation. Within hours, Kayla was receiving messages from activists, journalists, and even lawmakers asking for interviews. Her social media accounts, usually reserved for business updates and technology innovations, had turned into a platform for social change. In every post, every comment, there were calls for accountability, many of them reminding the airline and Captain Edwards that their actions were under intense scrutiny. People were angry, but they were also galvanized, rallying behind her. Kayla's phone rang. It was a private number. Kayla? Her father's voice came through, tight with urgency. I've already spoken to the board. They're not happy, but they can't avoid this anymore. There's going to be a press conference later today. They're trying to spin the story, make it sound like a misunderstanding. I need you to be ready. Dad, I can't just let them cover this up. Not after everything that's happened, Kayla replied, her voice firm. I'm going to speak out. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been silenced, ignored, or pushed aside because of people like Edwards. I'm with you, Charles affirmed. I'll make sure you have everything you need. You're not alone in this, Kayla. Before she could respond, the line went dead with a click. As the hours passed, the outrage only grew. Kayla's story was now in the headlines, dominating the news cycle. She couldn't help but feel the heavy weight of being thrust into the spotlight in such a personal way. But she also knew that there was no turning back now. She could feel the world turning with her, a collective momentum of support and outrage that was unstoppable. In the afternoon, an email arrived from the airline's public relations team requesting an urgent meeting with her. The message was diplomatic, of course, asking for a discussion in order to clear up the misunderstanding that had taken place. Kayla knew better. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a systematic problem, and it was going to take more than polite words to undo the damage they'd caused. A journalist from a major news network reached out next. Kayla, the message began, we'd love to have you on our evening news segment. We're covering the ongoing fallout from the airline incident. Would you be willing to speak publicly about your experience? The request was tempting, but Kayla hesitated. She wasn't someone who liked to put herself in front of a camera unless it was for business purposes. But this was different. This wasn't just about a personal grievance. It was about a larger issue, one that affected countless others. Her silence would only be a form of complicity. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she made her decision. She was going to stand up and speak out. She would show the world that she would not be silenced or erased. The press conference, the interviews, the stories, it all had to happen now, while the outrage was at its peak. She would use the momentum to fuel a movement of change, to force the airline and every other institution to confront the deep-rooted racism and prejudice that still festered in corners they thought were safe. Kayla sat in front of her laptop and began drafting a statement. It was short and to the point, but it would have a profound impact. What happened to me today is not an isolated incident. It is a reality that many people, especially people of color, face every day. But it will not stand. I will not stand down. Yes, I will use my voice to demand justice, not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been treated this way. It's time for the world to see what happens when you push back against injustice. She hit send, feeling the weight of those words as they left her fingertips. Within minutes, Her statement was all over the news. Social media exploded with support, with people from all walks of life echoing her words and demanding justice. The public outcry grew louder, more urgent. The airline was now under intense pressure. Captain Edwards was under fire from every direction. The hashtag Justice for Kayla Brooks continued to trend, each tweet, each post adding fuel to the growing blaze of accountability. Kayla had become the face of a movement, and she was ready to lead it. At Sky High Airways' sleek corporate headquarters, the mood was anything but sleek. The usually polished walls of the boardroom felt oppressively sterile as executives, public relations specialists, and legal advisors gathered for an emergency meeting. CEO Alan Graves, a seasoned leader with decades in the aviation industry, was pacing at the head of the long glass-topped table, his face drawn tight with frustration. "Every minute we delay is a disaster," Graves muttered, his voice laced with tension. "We need a strategy, and we need it now. This isn't just one disgruntled passenger. This is a global crisis." The PR team huddled in the corner, phones buzzing nonstop with inquiries from journalists and social media outlets. They were scrambling to control the narrative, but nothing they said seemed to stem the tide of outrage. It was as though the floodgates had opened, and now the river was rushing too fast for anyone to stop it. The hashtag is trending globally. Justice for Kayla Brooks is everywhere. One of the PR specialists, a young woman named Lisa, reported, tapping furiously on her tablet. "We can't ignore this. We need to respond in a way that's not just appeasing, but that signals genuine accountability, or we risk alienating an entire market." Alan Graves rubbed his temple, his thoughts swirling. He had been through public relations nightmares before. Employee scandals, mechanical failures, minor accidents, but nothing like this. The video of Kayla being forcibly removed from the plane had gone viral within hours, and now every major outlet, from news channels to online platforms, had picked up the story. The optics were disastrous. The media is calling this racism in the skies. "We need to control the message. We can't afford to look like we're dismissing this," another executive chimed in, a seasoned operations manager named Diane. Her voice was steady, but there was a clear edge of panic beneath her calm facade. Graves nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "We'll issue an apology, and I'll personally make a public statement to show we're taking immediate action. But that won't be enough. We need to go deeper. We need an investigation. If we don't show transparency, this will spiral. Fast." Meanwhile, just down the hall, Captain Richard Edwards was being escorted into a private conference room. He had been summoned to a meeting with Graves and senior management. He had heard murmurs about the incident on social media, but it wasn't until now that the weight of the situation began to fully dawn on him. Edwards, a man who prided himself on control, was rattled. He had been a respected captain for over 20 years. But the moment he entered the room and saw the faces of the airline executives, he realized that something much bigger was unfolding. "Captain Edwards," Graves began, his voice cold and clipped, "I need you to explain what happened on that flight." Edwards shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had already recounted his version of events to a few subordinates, but he wasn't prepared for the gravity of this conversation. I escorted the woman off the plane. She was disruptive, refused to comply with my instructions." "No," Graves interjected, his voice cutting through the air with sharp authority. "You didn't just escort her off the plane, Captain. You physically shoved her. And now, because of your actions, we're facing an international crisis." Edwards blinked, momentarily stunned. "What? But you didn't just push a passenger off our flight," Diane added, her tone pointed. "You pushed Kayla Brooks." There was a long, heavy silence as the name landed with a thud. Edwards' eyes widened in disbelief. He had no idea who the woman was when he ordered her removal. No idea that she was the daughter of Charles Brooks, the billionaire tycoon who partially owned Sky High Airways. Now, as the reality hit him, the air seemed to get thicker. His heart pounded in his chest. "Brooks?" Edwards stammered. "As in Charles Brooks? The tech mogul?" Graves nodded, his expression grim. "That's right, Charles Brooks. Your boss's boss. The one who's about to make this personal for you if you don't fix this mess." Edwards swallowed hard. He had been part of Sky High Airways for years, and he had always kept a strong professional reputation. He had never thought his actions would bring him under such intense scrutiny. Now, with the full weight of Brooks' influence bearing down on him, he realized just how badly he had miscalculated. "I didn't know. I had no idea," he muttered, his voice faltering. I thought she was just another difficult passenger." "Clearly you thought wrong," Graves said with a sharp edge to his tone. "This isn't just about poor customer service. This is about racism. You didn't see her as a person. You saw her as a threat. And now, you've made Sky High Airways the target of an international scandal." Edwards, now visibly sweating, leaned back in his chair, defeated. His mouth opened and closed as if trying to form words that wouldn't come. How could he have been so blind to the gravity of the situation? He had never considered how the woman's race might have played a role in his actions. But now, with the realization settling in, he could see it. The woman, a successful black billionaire, had been treated with disdain. Her wealth, her achievements, none of it mattered in that moment. "Do you have any idea what this could mean for the company?" Diane continued, her voice now colder. "Charles Brooks has the power to wipe us out with one phone call. If we don't fix this, we'll be facing a public relations nightmare and a massive lawsuit that we might not recover from." Edwards nodded, his throat dry, as the implications of his actions became painfully clear. There was no escaping the storm he had helped ignite. "We'll have to make a public statement," Graves concluded, his voice stern. "And you'll need to apologize, publicly. There's no other choice. But I warn you, Captain, if you don't handle this with humility and accountability, you won't have a career left to salvage. Do you understand me?" Edwards nodded again, his mind racing. He knew this was bigger than him now, bigger than any apology could fix. His career was on the line, and so was the fate of Sky High Airways. If he didn't navigate this crisis with care, the damage would extend far beyond the momentary scandal. It could change the entire landscape of the airline industry. As the meeting ended, the weight of what had just transpired hit Edwards harder than any turbulence he had ever encountered. This was no longer just a corporate issue. It was personal. And he was caught right in the center of it. As the days passed, Kayla's initial shock began to fade, replaced by a seething determination. She refused to let the incident define her or allow the airline's actions to go unchallenged. After receiving countless messages of support from her followers, friends, and colleagues, she knew she couldn't stay silent. Not when there were so many others who had faced similar injustices without the means to speak up. This wasn't just about her. This was about accountability, about equality, about forcing a system that had long overlooked the marginalized to finally confront its flaws. Kayla immediately reached out to her legal team, a group of sharp, no-nonsense professionals who had supported her through many high-profile negotiations and lawsuits. She explained the incident in detail, her voice steady, despite the anger that still simmered beneath her composed exterior. "This is beyond just a flight incident," she told them, her hands clasped tightly as she sat in her luxurious office, looking out over the city below. "This is systemic, and I won't let them sweep it under the rug. We have the power to change this, but only if we make them face it." Her lawyer, Angela Brooks, no relation, nodded in agreement. Angela had been Kayla's counsel for years and knew her client better than anyone. She understood the power of Kayla's influence, but more importantly, she knew that Kayla wasn't one to back down when she believed in something. "We'll file a lawsuit, but we'll also need to leverage the media. You've got an audience, Kayla. The world is already watching. If we want this to resonate, we need to control the narrative," Angela advised. Kayla agreed. She wasn't simply going to fight this in the courtroom, she was going to make it a movement. The next step was clear. She had to go public. Kayla arranged for an exclusive interview with a well-known investigative journalist, Simone Carter, who had gained a reputation for breaking stories on social justice and corporate corruption. Kayla knew that Simone would give her the platform to truly make an impact. The day of the interview, Kayla sat across from Simone in a private upscale studio. Her makeup was flawless, her hair perfectly styled, but it was the quiet power she radiated that captured the essence of who she was. She wasn't just a billionaire. She was a woman who had fought her entire life to get to this point and would not allow anyone to diminish her worth. As the cameras rolled, Simone leaned forward, her voice sympathetic yet probing. "Kayla, Many people are still in shock over what happened. Can you walk us through that day when you were asked to leave the plane? Kayla took a deep breath, her eyes steady, locking with the camera. She could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, but she was unshaken. I was boarding a flight home, exhausted from a long business trip, when an airline staff member told me my seat was unavailable. I showed them my boarding pass, but they insisted I needed to leave. I requested to speak with the captain, and when he arrived, his demeanor was dismissive and condescending. Despite presenting evidence that I had reserved a first-class seat, he told me I had to move or I would be removed. Simone nodded, leaning in closer. But it didn't stop there, did it? The incident escalated quickly. Kayla's eyes darkened slightly as she recalled the moment. No, the captain didn't just ask me to move. He physically pushed me out of my seat, and when I refused to leave, he had me escorted off the plane by security. I was humiliated, publicly, in front of the other passengers. Simone's voice softened. And yet, you didn't stay silent. You decided to fight back. Kayla's gaze hardened with resolve. This isn't just about me. This is about the countless others who faced similar treatment, but lacked the resources to fight back. This happens every day to people who don't have the platform, the power, or the privilege to speak up. I will use mine to make sure this never happens again. The room was silent for a moment. Simone sat back, clearly moved by the strength in Kayla's voice. And the response? Since this story broke, people have been coming forward with their own experiences of racial discrimination. What do you hope comes from all this? Kayla looked directly into the camera, her words deliberate. I hope people realize that we don't have to accept this. Racism, bias, prejudice, they're not just things we read about in the news. They're things we experience every single day, and they affect people in ways that go beyond just personal humiliation. These issues affect careers, opportunities, lives. If I can help others find their voice, if I can help them feel that they don't have to stay quiet, then I've done my job. As the interview wrapped up, Kayla felt a surge of empowerment. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. Sky High Airways wasn't going to back down easily. But this was bigger than her. This was about sparking a revolution, one where the injustices people faced in silence were finally exposed for what they were: unacceptable. Over the next few days, Kayla's interview went viral. The video was shared millions of times, sparking conversations across social media. The hashtag Justice for Kayla Brooks exploded, trending worldwide as people from all walks of life spoke up, sharing their own stories of mistreatment and discrimination. Kayla's strength and poise in the face of adversity resonated deeply with millions, particularly within communities that had long felt marginalized. They saw in her a reflection of their own struggles, their own silent battles. As more individuals came forward with their experiences, it became clear that the issue wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a systemic problem. In the weeks that followed, Kayla was inundated with messages of support. Celebrities, activists, and everyday people reached out, offering their encouragement. The media coverage intensified, and Sky High Airways found themselves on the defensive, scrambling to manage the fallout. Kayla knew it was just the beginning. She wasn't going to let this die down until the people who had wronged her, and so many others, were held accountable. She had the resources, the platform, and the resolve to make sure that this was more than just a story. This was a movement. A fight for dignity, for respect, and for justice. And Kayla Brooks was going to lead it, one step at a time. The courtroom was filled with anticipation, the air thick with tension. Kayla Brooks sat beside her father, Charles, her posture unwavering despite the emotional toll this battle had taken on her. Her gaze was sharp, her eyes fixed straight ahead, determined to see this through to the end. The courtroom, a sea of polished wood and somber faces, seemed almost too quiet as the trial of Captain Richard Edwards unfolded. The defense had attempted to paint the incident as a simple misunderstanding, a case of miscommunication on an otherwise routine flight. But Kayla knew the truth. The truth had already been revealed to the world. This was about power and prejudice, a blatant disregard for her rights as both a passenger and a human being. What Edwards had done went far beyond the confines of a single flight. It was a reflection of the racial biases that had persisted in society for far too long. She was here to make sure that no one else would be subjected to the same kind of humiliation she had endured. As the trial began, Kayla's legal team, led by the formidable Angela Brooks, wasted no time in making their case. Angela, a seasoned litigator with a reputation for taking on the toughest opponents, stood with an air of calm confidence. Her voice was clear and commanding as she began her opening statement. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have here is not a simple case of customer service gone wrong. This is about a man, a captain, who used his position of power to assault and degrade an innocent woman simply because of her race, Angela began, her eyes scanning the jury. We will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Captain Richard Edwards acted with both malice and a deep-seated bias, and that his actions were not only unjust, they were criminal. Kayla could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air as Angela continued. The defense had painted Edwards as a man who had acted out of frustration, a pilot who had simply lost control in a difficult situation. But the evidence Kayla's team had gathered told a different story. First came the witness testimonies, some from fellow passengers who had been on the flight and had seen the entire altercation unfold. One woman, her voice shaky but resolute, spoke up in Kayla's defense. I was seated 2 rows behind her. I saw the entire thing, the woman said, her hands trembling as she pointed to Kayla. Captain Edwards didn't just ask her to move. He shoved her. He pushed her out of her seat like she was a piece of trash, and when she tried to explain, he didn't listen. He ordered her off the plane. I was disgusted. Another passenger, a middle-aged man who had been in the boarding area, stood up, his voice steady as he relayed his account. It wasn't just the physical assault, it was the way he spoke to her. There was no reason for him to be so condescending and rude. She didn't deserve that. Nobody does. Kayla sat quietly, but inside, her heart swelled with gratitude. These voices, the voices of the people who had witnessed the event and who were now speaking up, were the key to this case. They were the ones who could help turn the tide in her favor. Then came the most damning piece of evidence. Video footage from the incident, captured by a bystander who had been recording when the altercation occurred. The video had been widely shared on social media in the days following the incident and had played a significant role in galvanizing public support. It was a moment frozen in time, a clear image of Edwards, his face twisted in anger as he physically shoved Kayla out of her seat. The footage left no room for misinterpretation. The defense attempted to discredit the video, arguing that it had been edited and didn't show the full context. But the footage spoke for itself. It was crystal clear, and the jury knew it. Edwards' actions were unprovoked, and the video captured not only his aggression, but the cold, dismissive manner in which he treated Kayla. His demeanor had been arrogant, his actions cruel. Captain Edwards, once the embodiment of confidence in his uniform, now seemed a shadow of himself. His eyes darted nervously around the courtroom, avoiding the gaze of the jury and the public. The man who had once wielded his authority without hesitation now appeared broken, his bravado fading as the weight of the evidence grew heavier. The defense tried to redirect, attempting to frame Kayla as an entitled billionaire who had overreacted to a simple misunderstanding. But Angela was relentless. She tore down every argument they made, highlighting the inconsistencies in Edwards' testimony and the lack of remorse he had shown. This isn't about a mistake, ladies and gentlemen. This is about the abuse of power, the mistreatment of a passenger based solely on her race, Angela declared, her voice unwavering. This is about a captain who chose to let his prejudices dictate his actions, and as a result, this woman was humiliated, assaulted, and forced to face discrimination in the most public of ways. Kayla's gaze never wavered from the front of the courtroom as Angela spoke. She wasn't doing this just for herself. She was doing this for every person who had been pushed down, for every person who had been made to feel less than, for every person who had been silenced. She was using her platform, her privilege, to ensure that this kind of injustice would not stand. As the prosecution closed its case, the jury was left with a mountain of evidence. Captain Edwards down, defense had failed to sway the narrative. The truth was undeniable. The man who had once stood in judgment of others, who had used his power to humiliate an innocent woman, was now standing in judgment himself. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the jury deliberated. Kayla's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for the verdict. She sat with her father, who, though usually calm and composed, could not mask the strain on his face. This battle had been long and hard, but Kayla knew that it wasn't just about winning a case. It was about sending a message to the world. Minutes passed, then hours. The tension in the room was palpable. Finally, the jury returned, and the courtroom fell into an expectant hush. The foreperson stood and addressed the judge. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Captain Richard Edwards, guilty of assault and racial discrimination." A wave of relief and triumph swept over Kayla as the words echoed in her ears. The justice she had fought for was finally being delivered. But this was only the beginning. Kayla knew the fight wasn't over. This trial was just one chapter in a much larger movement, one she intended to lead. The battle for justice, for equality, had only just begun. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the courtroom, pressing down on Kayla's chest. Hours had passed since the jury had retired to deliberate, each minute stretching into eternity as she waited for the moment that would determine the outcome of this long and painful journey. The noise of the courtroom had faded, leaving only the sound of her heartbeat in her ears. She sat beside her father, Charles, whose usual calm demeanor had given way to a subtle but noticeable tension. The two of them had fought this battle together, Kayla with her legal team, and Charles, a man used to navigating high-stakes deals and crises, providing his unwavering support every step of the way. They had come so far. The judge, a stern yet composed woman in her mid-50s, called the court to order, her gavel striking with authority. The room fell into a profound silence as she looked out over the gathered crowd. Her expression was inscrutable, but her presence was commanding. Every eye in the room was on her as she motioned for the foreperson of the jury to rise. Kayla's heart thudded painfully in her chest as the foreperson stood and turned to face the judge, holding the verdict in their hands. Kayla's breath caught in her throat, and she felt her palms grow clammy as she anxiously waited for the words that would either deliver her justice or leave her with a bitter, unresolved pain. The foreperson cleared their throat, a signal that the verdict was about to be read. Kayla's body stiffened, her back straightening as if bracing for impact. She reached for her father's hand, feeling the reassuring warmth of his grip. He gave her a small but meaningful squeeze, his eyes locked with hers, silently telling her that whatever the outcome, they had already won in ways that mattered far beyond this courtroom. The foreperson's voice rang out clearly, their words reverberating in the still air. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Captain Richard Edwards, guilty of assault and racial discrimination." For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. Time stood still. Kayla felt a rush of emotions flood through her: relief, triumph, disbelief, and a profound sense of vindication. The roar of the crowd, the gasps of those in attendance, all seemed distant as her mind processed the words she had longed to hear. Captain Edwards, the man who'd humiliated her, who had tried to dismiss her with an unjust and cruel act of violence, was now held accountable. The legal system had spoken, and justice had been served. Tears pricked at the corners of Kayla's eyes, but she held them back, her face a picture of controlled strength. She wasn't going to cry. She had cried enough over the years, and this moment wasn't about pain. It was about triumph. It was about proving to herself and to the world that she was worth fighting for. That her success, her dignity, and her humanity deserved respect, no matter who she was or where she came from. She glanced at her father, and the pride in his eyes made her heart swell. Charles Brooks, the man who had built an empire and paved the way for her success, had always been a pillar of strength. But now, in this moment, he was more than just her father. He was a symbol of everything they had fought for, of the years of hard work, the late nights, the sacrifices, and the relentless drive to make sure that no one would ever dismiss or underestimate their worth again. As the judge's gavel struck one final time, signaling the conclusion of the verdict, the room erupted into applause. Some of the people in the audience had been present during the trial, witnesses who had followed the case from its inception. Others were simply supporters who had seen the viral videos of Kayla's mistreatment and had rallied behind her cause. They were all here today because of her bravery, her willingness to speak out, and her refusal to allow injustice to go unchallenged. Charles leaned in close to Kayla, his voice a soft whisper in her ear. "We did it," he said, his words thick with emotion. "Not just for you, but for everyone who's ever been silenced." Kayla nodded, the truth of his statement hitting her like a wave. This wasn't just her victory. This was a victory for every person who had ever been made to feel small, for every person who had been ignored or belittled because of their race, their gender, or their social standing. This was for the countless others who had faced adversity and discrimination, but had been too afraid or too powerless to speak out. She wasn't just standing here for herself. She was standing for all of them. The judge addressed the courtroom one last time, ordering that Captain Edwards be taken into custody pending sentencing. But for Kayla, the fight was far from over. This was just one step in a larger battle, and she knew that her journey had only just begun. As she and her father stood up, the room erupted in cheers. Kayla smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that came from pride alone. It was a smile that reflected the strength she had found within herself, the resilience that had carried her through the darkest of days. She had faced humiliation, abuse, and prejudice, but she had never broken. And now, she was walking out of that courtroom with her head held high, knowing that justice had been served. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Kayla could finally breathe easy. But she also knew that her victory in the courtroom was only the beginning. This was the spark that would ignite a much larger fire, a movement that would challenge the status quo, confront racism, and demand equality for everyone, no matter who they were. As she walked out of the courtroom, hand in hand with her father, the world seemed to open up before her, full of possibilities. The fight was far from over, but with this victory, Kayla knew that nothing could ever silence her again. The days following the trial were a whirlwind. Sky High Airways, once a proud and respected name in the aviation industry, found itself embroiled in the aftermath of the scandal. The company's board, scrambling to restore their tarnished reputation, issued a public apology that, while overdue, carried significant weight. In a rare public admission, CEO Alan Graves expressed regret for the actions of Captain Edwards, promising swift and decisive action to overhaul the airline's internal culture. Sky High Airways is committed to ensuring that no passenger ever faces such treatment again, the statement read. We are implementing comprehensive reforms, including anti-discrimination training for all employees and a review of our hiring practices to ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion are upheld at every level. Captain Edwards, the man who had once exuded arrogance and entitlement, was promptly dismissed. His actions, now seen in the stark light of public scrutiny, left him with little support. The once powerful figure had become a symbol of everything that was wrong within the airline, a relic of the past that had no place in a company determined to move forward. While the legal battle had been victorious, it was the reforms that would ensure lasting change, Kayla knew. But for Kayla, the apology and the firing were only a small part of the broader fight. The real victory lay in the power of the movement that had been sparked by her courage and the millions of voices that had joined her in the call for justice. The hashtag Justice for Kayla Brooks had become a rallying cry for those who had experienced discrimination, not just in the skies, but in all corners of society. It wasn't just about one incident. It was about dismantling the systems of inequality that allowed such behavior to flourish in the first place. Kayla's role in the movement had transformed her. What had started as a deeply personal fight for justice had grown into a platform that could influence real, meaningful change. She had become an advocate not only for herself, but for all those who had been silenced, ignored, or mistreated. She used her voice to challenge the systems that upheld racism, sexism, and all forms of discrimination, whether overt or subtle. Weeks later, Kayla stood in front of a crowd of supporters at a press conference held in downtown Denver. The warm autumn sun bathed the crowd in golden light, casting a sense of optimism over the moment. The air was thick with anticipation as cameras clicked and the hum of voices filled the air. The event wasn't just about her, though she had been at the center of it all, but about the shared mission to make the world a better, fairer place. Kayla, dressed in a simple yet elegant white dress, stood at the podium, her back straight, her eyes resolute. She could feel the weight of the moment, The years of struggle, the countless voices of people who had suffered in silence, all coming together in this defining moment. The press conference was being broadcast live, and millions around the world were watching. As the crowd quieted, Kayla spoke, her voice calm but filled with an undeniable strength. "This is not the end," she began, pausing to let her words settle in the air. "This is a new beginning, a new chapter in the fight for justice, equality, and respect. What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It is a reflection of the systemic issues that plague so many industries, so many spaces, and so many lives. But I stand here today, not as a victim, but as a symbol of what is possible when we come together to demand change." She paused again, looking out at the crowd, her gaze firm and unwavering. Behind her, a banner hung that read, "Together for Justice, Together for Equality." Today, we are not just fighting for the right to sit in a first-class seat or to be treated with dignity in an airport, Kayla continued. We are fighting for the right to be seen, heard, and respected in every space. In boardrooms, in schools, in hospitals, in every corner of society where people like me, people who are often marginalized, are told they don't belong. We are here to say, we belong. Our voices matter. We are worthy of respect. The crowd erupted into applause, and Kayla felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This was more than just words. This was a movement, a collective call for change that was louder and more powerful than ever before. It was a movement that had been born from pain, but it was fueled by hope. Kayla continued, her words ringing with conviction. "This fight is not mine alone. This is for everyone who has ever faced discrimination, who has been overlooked or mistreated. This is for every person of color, every woman, every member of a marginalized group who has been told that they don't deserve to take up space in this world. We must continue to fight for justice and equality in every space. We must push for systemic change. We must challenge the status quo and demand a world where everyone is treated with the respect they deserve." Her words were met with cheers and applause, the sound of collective hope reverberating through the crowd. Kayla's heart swelled with pride, knowing that this was just the beginning. The journey ahead would be long, but she was ready. She would continue to use her platform to shine a light on the injustices that so many people faced every day. She would continue to advocate for change, for fairness, and for a world where discrimination had no place. As the press conference came to an end, Kayla stepped away from the podium, her father by her side. The two of them walked through the crowd, their heads held high, knowing that the world was watching. They had made a difference. But more importantly, they had started something much bigger than themselves, a movement that would outlast them, that would change the world for generations to come. Kayla had found her true purpose, and it was clear to her now. This was just the beginning. The road ahead would be challenging, but with the support of the millions who had stood by her, she knew she could make an impact. Together, they could create a world where everyone's humanity was honored and where equality was not just a dream, but a reality for all. And in that moment, as Kayla walked into the future, she felt a deep sense of peace, a quiet but powerful knowing that she had already started to change the world. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey. Kayla's story is not just about overcoming adversity. It's about the power of standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you. It's about the strength of conviction and the undeniable force of unity in the face of injustice. We hope this story inspired you as much as it inspired us. Remember, every small act of courage creates ripples that can change the world. A huge thank you for watching and supporting us. Your time and engagement mean everything. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and share it with your friends. We love hearing your thoughts and feedback. And if you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This way, you'll never miss the exciting new content we have in store. We've got more powerful stories, thought-provoking ideas, and inspiring moments coming your way. Stay tuned, stay inspired, and join us as we continue this journey together. Because together, we're creating a world full of possibilities. See you in the next video.